Okay, AP. We're going to do this one again with you having to look at me. Sorry, but there's some things that there's some technical issues on my end. Who cares? We are probably going to get through almost all the pages that I signed, but not quite. So I have my trusty, dusty book here, and I've got some supplements too. But I'm going to cover those pretty well and have some mercy on you if you didn't get through those. So, again, if this was a typical school day, you'd walk in and we would just sort of pick up where we left off, and I'll do some reminding for you now. If I were to have a pop quiz today, it'd be over what you were supposed to read last night. Just in case you happen to have a pop quiz sometime in your future. You know, I mean, you do know that, of course, you have to have a pop quiz before the end of the unit on Thursday. Of course, pop quiz has to happen in a live session, and you have live sessions Tuesday and Friday. Sure, that makes sense. I'm sure you're figuring it out if you haven't already. Okay, so looking at what you were supposed to have read, if I were to just guess, I might say something like question number 1. And remember, you're just going to have a blank form to type these things into, and I'm just going to read them after the fact. You'll have to submit by a certain time, like seconds after I ask it. Oh, I certainly wouldn't ask what year Columbus did his damage. I might ask something like, name 2 things that were brought from the New World back to the Old World, or what was the claim to fame of Francisco Coronado, or Ferdinand Magellan? Or I might say, what was the term? I would love this one. What is the term that allowed the Spanish to enslave Native Americans as long as they promised to Christianize them? That would definitely be a pop quiz question. I'd like to pick out those sorts of things. What do we call the people that represent a mixture of Spanish heritage and Native heritage? Those would be the mestizos. So there are things like that that I would ask as a pop quiz question. So look for that in your future. So let's pick up where we left off. Let's do a share screen so I could show you some amazing map. Actually, I think it's in a different amazing map, but that's okay. You might have seen that page there. That's kind of funny. That's me drawing a caravel. Remember, we were talking about those. And do you remember the impetus for this? Why is it that all of a sudden explorers have such a greater ability to go further and further than they ever had before? Well, after the Crusades, the exchange of certain goods, particularly silk and other rare items for Europe, made it so that it just became financially just really lucrative to go ahead and try to trade these items. But when you have an item that's being traded all the way across the continent and then through the Mediterranean Sea, by the time it gets to Europe, boy, it is really, really been marked up. And I think we used a red beanbag or something like that. You were buying for $1 or $10 or whatever, and you were selling it for $2 or $3 grand. And then you know that the Portuguese figured out a way around this. And of course, the Portuguese figured, oh, what we'll do is we will simply take well, I wouldn't call it a shortcut, but we'll do an end around all of the middlemen, and we will go straight to India, China. Really, this whole area was called at the time the Indies, which comes into play today. So that brings us to today's story. So if you can, I don't think I can, it won't let me zoom in on this, but as you know, Spain is right here, right next to Portugal. And Spain is looking around going, okay, the money, we can't get in on the money because we're not in the middle here. We can't get on the coast of Africa because the Portuguese have fortified the coast of Africa. Really, we don't have any other option unless maybe we go this way. Because remember, nobody knew this, well, other than 72 million people living there, nobody in Europe knew, or Asia, that this existed. So this is sort of the setting for the conquest of Spain. Spain actually was divided up into 5 empires. By this point, it was really down to sort of 3, Aragon, Castile, and Granada. But there's a marriage between this royal couple, Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella then conquer the last remaining territory. And by the way, Isabella, in her suit of armor, did the heavy lifting on that, but that's for a European history class. And they unite Spain into one kingdom. And now that they're united, they do some really gruesome stuff to people they consider non-believers. That's the Spanish Inquisition, just horrendous stuff. But for our purposes today, they're also willing to invest in some crazy ideas that might gain them access to the Indies. That's where you have an Italian explorer by the name of Christopher Columbus, who basically says, I've got a crazy idea. I'm going to go to the Indies by sailing around the world. Now, here's where I've got to correct this historical misnomer. I think I hear probably every class I think I've ever taught in AP that, oh, I thought his big deal was he knew the earth wasn't flat. Okay. Huge misnomer. There's a lot of misnomers early on in this unit. People didn't think the earth was flat. Not most people. As many people thought the earth was flat in 1492 as today think that we didn't land on the moon. Like, it's a conspiracy theory out there. And I know there's some flat earthers out there right now. But learned people knew that the earth was round. Just all the math said it was. Columbus knew the earth was round. This was not his claim to fame. This did not make him unique. What made him unique is actually a terrible mistake he made. Many scholars put the circumference of the earth at somewhere around 24 or 25,000 miles. If I remember basic geography, I think it's just short of 25,000 miles. I don't know. It was in the ballpark. Columbus said, oh, no. It's only 8,000 miles around. Therefore, I think in about a 3,000 mile journey, tops, high end, 3,000 miles, you're going to be able to get to somewhere in this region. That's what he's banking on. And so the Spanish, I guess you could say, decide to invest in this crazy idea because for them, in the scheme of things, it's not that risky. Now, by the way, there's always scandal in world history. There are some scholars who also believe that part of the motive was because Columbus and Catherine of Aragon had a thing. I don't think the evidence is very good, but scandalous gossip, love it. And so they take an investment. They go ahead and they let him have 3 ships. And by the way, his 3 ships were crewed with a lot of people who were desperate to get out of there because of the Inquisition, where they were torturing people for not being Catholic, essentially. There were a lot of Jewish refugees who were saying, we've got to get out of there, the expulsion. And so many of them are volunteering to be on these 3 ships. So Columbus then, October 12th, 1492, ends up in this area of the world thinking he's in this area of the world. Put this on my list of reasons why I don't like Christopher Columbus, and I'm being nice. Christopher Columbus, when I was growing up, I think we finally have started to come around on this, and boy, would I love to be considered a part of this. But when I was growing up, Christopher Columbus discovered America. Okay. I've got to watch my blood pressure here. You know, I'm getting older. I don't want to just plop right here in a video lesson, although kind of a cool way to go. Christopher Columbus can't discover a place that 72 million other people already were at. 72 million people. Now, you want to get technically, you say, oh, he's the first European to discover it. Nope. No, he's not. Nope. No way. Virtually every historian believes that Eric the Red was the first European to make it to the New World. Eric the Red in 1000, give or take, AD. 1000. So beat him by 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 500 years. Not even close to being first. Second off, you may not even know this, Columbus went back 4 times. 4 times. By the time he had come back from the 3rd voyage, there's this guy named Amerigo Vespucci who's like, dude, you're not where you think you are. You're in some whole other new world, which is why the Americas are named after Amerigo Vespucci. But Columbus said, no, I know where I'm at. I'm in the Indies. What? Can you say you discovered a place if you've been there 4 times? 72 million people have already been there and you don't know where it is once you get there? You don't know what it is once you get there? Then he's going to claim everything for himself because he discovered it. He'd never been there before. I remind you, there's 72 million people already there. Just because you discover it for the first time doesn't mean you get it. So let's go through this. Let's see. Obviously, I've never been to any of your houses, but if I just go to Samantha Collins, if I go to the Collins household, which I've never been at before, and I discover a large flat screen TV, do I get to just take it on my own? Because I'm like, well, I proclaim this for the House of Penrose. I've never seen it before. What? If I go to Easton's house and I see like cash laying out, can I go, well, I've never discovered this cash before, so it's mine, so I'm going to take it? Are you kidding me right now? By the way, other teachers must be wondering, why is he so upset? No one else is in the room. So Columbus discovers the New World, a place he didn't know where he was at. 72 million people were already there, but it creates this huge, ginormous, world-altering change that basically many textbooks will just call the Columbian Exchange. It's called the Columbian Exchange because it's named after Christopher Columbus. Now, one last anger thing. The whole reason that Native Americans are referred to as quote unquote Indians is because Columbus thought he was in the Indies. So he's like, oh, these people must be the Indians. We had written record of the types of goods that people from the Indies had, and it didn't match up. We had written record of what people look like. It didn't match up. What they dress like didn't match up. If he's in the Indies, how come Native Americans don't have any silk? That's one of the big things you're going for. Now they had other things, gold and silver and other things that they wanted. I'm getting hyped up. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the Columbian Exchange. So before I show you this list, or as I show you this list, I'll let you know that you have to be very careful. We now know when you're introducing, say, one species to to an area where that species is not indigenous. So, for example, if you travel to a foreign country, they're very careful. You don't take plants. You don't take even like sometimes fruits or vegetables out of that. I don't have a ton of foreign country travel, but even going to the Bahamas once, they're like, well, you can't take this, this, and this. I mean, it's like really boring stuff, but what they're afraid is maybe there's some sort of spider that's on that pineapple that if you take it home, that's going to introduce the spider that we're not used to, and then all these horrible things happen. Columbus had no regard for this, and one of the few things I'll say to be fair to him is he certainly, to be fair, had no idea, but these things mammothly changed things, including, most importantly, the diseases that he introduced. But we can go kind of back and forth on this list, old world to new. So before the 1492 landing, there weren't apples or grapefruits in the Americas. Now, the New World introduced us to things like corn and potato, which are such staples that even your history teacher in Friday's lecture said, oh, you grow corn here. Well, actually, they didn't before the Native Americans, but you get the idea. Now, not all of them are positive or negative. So old world to new. This one should blow you away. I know the first time I read this, it blew me away. Horses were not native to the Americas. They just weren't. We think of Native Americans as being so intricately intertwined with horses, but horses were introduced, particularly by the Spanish, to the New World. So on the other side, New World to old, you're going to see that I put negative things in red. The negative things from the old world far outweigh the negative things on the right side. But the big one, the historical impact, is going to be the introduction of not the dandelions, not great, not the daisies, not great, the smallpox, yellow fever, and malaria. Now, for a little revenge, Native Americans introduced to Europeans syphilis, but that's still not exactly on par with smallpox, yellow fever, and malaria. That Columbian Exchange completely alters history because the Native Americans, in Bailey's words, remember, were marooned by the rest of humans for tens of thousands of years, or 10,000 years, something like that. They didn't develop the same immunities then that Europeans had. And Europeans, generally speaking, sounds mean, that's a big B, but we'll ignore that. Europeans, in general, were more crowded and had less sanitary conditions. So Native Americans are going to end up being drastically punished by the fact that they're not as exposed to disease because they had better sanitary habits. So they don't have the immunity. This should be intuitive to you, especially during a pandemic, but even like compared to your own life. If I look back at your life, what years you were most sick, my guess is, for most of you, it would be the first year you were in public school because you were exposed to the most germs. And then once you get exposed to all those germs, you kind of build up an immunity. As a teacher, the worst years as far as me being sick would be the first 2 years because I got 120 sets of germs coming at me that I wasn't used to being exposed to. Now, I've had students that said, oh, my worst year was by far 8th grade. And then a lot of times they find out, oh, they were homeschooled until 8th grade. It's the same concept. So you build up this immunity. Well, that's just within the scope of our lifetimes. Imagine what happens when it's 10,000 years of lifetime, so they don't have the immunity. So Native Americans die at this horrific rate. By most estimates, historians believe that 90% of the Native Americans who are here, that's 65 million of the 72 million we kind of logically guesstimate that were here, died of disease within 100 years. 90%. That's how the Europeans are able to just decimate through North and South America, particularly North America, because it was already sparsely populated anyway. It's not because their technology was better. In some cases it was, but in some it wasn't, like in agricultural technology. It's because 90% died off from disease. Now, as a history guy, when I look back over like the worst things to happen to humanity that were purposeful. So I'm going to leave out the Black Plague or the Black Death, bubonic plague, whatever you want to call it. Let's just focus on sort of other things. First things that should come to mind, slavery, particularly African slavery in North and South America, and the Holocaust. So those two things, estimates vary greatly about how many millions of lives were lost. They're both horrific. And you might say, well, we can't count this in that category because the Holocaust was a decision, a horrific decision that somebody did. The African slavery was a decision that people made. That was something humans did to other humans. This is more like the plague because it just happened. I would argue it's not quite cleanly in either category. Columbus didn't know. Columbus didn't know what he was introducing. Once the Spanish figured it out, once the English figured it out, they then did things like say, oh, we don't really like that Native American tribe. When we trade with them, we're going to give them blankets infected with smallpox. They're essentially doing primitive germ warfare. And so this is a Holocaust of sorts on a scale never matched before in human history. It's right up there with the worst things that have ever happened. And so that's what opens up the door to these conquistadors, these Spanish conquerors. Bailey has this quote later on where he says, everybody thinks it's these virgin forests that have never been touched. It's not that, it's that they're widowed. It's that the people that used to be there have died off at a rate of 90%. So let's talk a little bit about these conquistadors. They rifle through them. It's a take-home test. We're not too worried about you knowing all these names because you're going to just look them up for the test. But Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean. There were a few million people living in and on the other coast of the Pacific Ocean, but sure. Ferdinand Magellan gets credit for being the first person to circumnavigate the globe. What a ripoff this is. I remember how bitter I was when I read his story. So he takes off with not enough food, not enough water, 260 men, 18 make it back. And they have horrific tales to tell, including eating shoe leather and eating rats and maybe each other. And Ferdinand Magellan's not one of the ones who made it. He got killed by natives somewhere in the Pacific. We don't know the names of the 18 people who made it because they weren't in charge of the ship. The guy who died before they were done, no. If I had to eat shoe leather and rats, my name better be in the history book. I guess you also have to go around the world. I guess I could eat shoe leather and rats, but you know what I mean. Francisco Coronado, De Soto, these conquistadors go through this territory. And they are greatly aided by this horrific disease. They also are aided by the fact that the natives tend to be welcoming, if not naive, about them. And they tend to be completely dismissive of their humanity. So I'm going to give you an example of Pizarro. Pizarro is going to take on the Incas. And the Incas had a leader, a warrior king by the name of Atahualpa. And Atahualpa was beloved by his people. And Pizarro took him hostage and said, I can't remember how much gold, but it was a ridiculous, like thousands of pounds of gold to release him. And the locals gather up all the gold they can find and give him exactly what he demanded. And then standing in front of a crowd of thousands of natives, Pizarro slit the throat of Atahualpa and said, we don't have to make bargains with natives. You're savages because you're not our religion. It's just insane what they did, but their own government had a policy, which I think might tie to your essay. Their own government had a policy that allowed them to do and treat natives however they wanted to, called encomienda. Encomienda essentially says, you may treat and enslave Native Americans any way you see fit, but in the long run, it is your moral obligation to Christianize them, to introduce them to their religion, which in Spain is absolutely Catholicism. So it gives them a green light. Now, some of these men truly were interested in spreading what they believed to be religious truth. I don't get into religious truth. I just tell you what people believe. We live in America. You can believe whatever you want. But in the eyes of the Spanish conquistadors, Catholicism is the religious truth, and they really do believe in this. Others had no interest in that at all. They only saw money. So they took the part of encomienda that was beneficial to them, oh, we can enslave people, and then push that forward to conquer their territories. Now, another example of this, which it's so insane, it's almost comical, if it wasn't for the death of thousands of people. Hernando Cortez in 1519 is a conquistador who comes across another great leader in what we would think of today as Mexico, Montezuma II. And Montezuma II is a little bit more skeptical, but not of Cortez, who only had 600 men, 16 horses, and 3 cannons. And he's going to take over this vast territory with just 600 men. I mean, think about how few that is. Like, more people go to Sandusky High School. I could muster up an army. Let me rephrase. Talbot could muster up an army to the same size that Cortez had. That doesn't even make sense. How could you conquer Mexico with that? Well, 1, 90% had died because of disease. 2, poor Montezuma II believed in a religious story, allegory, whatever we want to call it. I'm not coming up with the right word. He had a faith that told him that there was a God by the name of, I can never pronounce this, so I'm going to spell it out, and hopefully you read it. Quetzalcoatl. We'll call him Big Q. And they believed in this God, Big Q, that he was going to come back and do all these amazing things. And you would know Big Q was coming because Big Q would come on a floating island. He would be 8 foot tall and have a chest made of stone. And by some accounts, he would even have 4 legs. So here comes Cortez. And he comes off of this boat, bigger than any boat any of these natives had seen before. It looks like, shall we say, a floating island, on horseback in armor. Now, when the horses are in armor and they're in armor, would you think it was one being? Listen, if you believed in a religion that said 4-legged, 8-foot guys are going to come off with chests of stone, and of course they're wearing armor, it's not stone, but close enough. Are you really going to start quibbling with the details? You're going to be like, oh, that's Big Q. And so when Montezuma II says, are you the God that we've been waiting for? Of course, Cortez could have said, no, I'm just a man from Spain and I'd love to trade with you. He says, why, yes, I am. And I've come here for the gold. And so he takes full advantage of the fact that they think that he is this God. And by the time they realize what's really going on, they've already been decimated by the diseases that these very gods have introduced. So they make quick work of it. And then they go through, there's other details, and there's no shortage of details of the horrific things that the Spanish conquistadors did. And some just, many are cruel. You can Google cruel things conquistadors did, and you'll have a million examples for your essay. Don Juan de Onate, he cut off the foot of every survivor of a particular battle. The moral problems with slavery make it completely untenable. But then on top of that, you're cutting off the foot of the people that you're enslaving. That's also illogical and untenable. There are all these horrible things. But oddly, over time, we have proof that the Spanish treatment did evolve. And that's because there's really no way that the two cultures over time completely melded into one culture called the mestizo culture. It's Spanish and native. It's the two combined because in time, I guess you could say through encomienda, the natives were introduced to Catholicism. As soon as they were, if you accepted it, the Spanish accepted you as an equal. We know this for fact because they married each other. They intermingled, had children, and this mestizo culture, which is a blending of the two, which is impossible to mix up, to differentiate, exist. And so the Spanish acceptance, I guess I would say, it's amazing how cruel and barbaric the Spanish are at first. If you were a native, you don't want to run into a Spanish conquistador. You'd rather run into an English guy. They're not going to be great either. But the Spanish conquistador is going to be way crueler. In the long run, the Spanish will accept you as an equal if you convert to their religion. The English do not. The English have their own fair share of cruelties too. Don't misunderstand this. But there's no great moment where they say, oh, as a matter of fact, oh, the bee is back and he's on my keyboard and he is ginormous, but we'll keep going on. As a matter of fact, you don't know the first name, or you don't know the name of the first Spaniard who married a native. And the reason you don't know the name, the reason I don't know the name, is because it happened all the time, all over the place at the same time. There could have been 1,000 people on the same day. You do know, at least you might, if you watch Disney movies, the name of the first English person who did, because it was such an outlier, where people were like, what? An English guy is going to marry a native? And we'll get into all the problems of that in the next chapter. But home stretch. I have to destroy one paragraph that Bailey wrote. I'm going to read this, and I've decided I'm going to pick on Easton. I'm going to pretend that. Easton, we'll bring you back into this a little bit. Okay, I'm going to take off the glasses because glasses are for far away. I'm going to, okay. So the book says there's this black legend, this false concept that conquerors merely tortured and butchered the Indians, quote, killing for Christ. I'm reading this all verbatim. Stole their gold, infected them with smallpox, and left little but misery behind. The Spanish invaders did indeed kill, enslave, and infect countless natives, but, okay, I can't read the rest of that sentence. The rest of the sentence goes, but eventually their cultures intermingled. You can't say all those horrific things and then go, but. So imagine for Easton, next year I'm writing a letter of recommendation for him. And I'm writing, oh, he's the meanest person I've ever seen. He physically assaulted all of these people. He said all these profane things. He robbed this bank. He did this thing. But, great essay writer, what? You can't do that. You can't say that in the textbook. The black legend is real. The Native Americans were horrifically treated by the Spanish. But mestizo culture did emerge, and so eventually it was accepted. This is reflected in your supplemental reading. So we'll finish up today. So we finished this first chapter. I didn't get to the first couple pages in the English chapter. We'll get to that tomorrow. We'll catch up there, and we'll be completely caught up. But in these readings you had, Sup 1, Sup 2, Sup 3, that I posted Thursday or Friday, you basically have, and if you didn't read it, that's okay. This time you're going to get away with it because I'm going to give you the highlights. You have two different Spanish perspectives, just to give you an idea of what was going on. There's Sepulveda and there's Las Casas, okay? So Sepulveda kind of represents that sort of meaner aspect of the Spanish culture. He says in several writings, I think you might have one quote in your essay about him, but I'm going to read some more from a more extensive thing that you have the copy of. So we have a perfect right, we being the Spanish, to rule these barbarians because they are inferior to us, like children to adults or women to men. Ladies, be offended. Compare them to the gentleness and humanity of our people. What? The Spanish at that very moment were conducting the Spanish Inquisition, where they invented new ways to torture people, including the rack, where they tied you up, hands over your head, feet that way, and turned cranks in opposite directions and slowly split you apart, sometimes adding a little knife when you were completely taught to just kind of bad things. But he says, oh, look how kind we are compared to their inhumanity. Listen, I got news for you. Europeans have no shortage of inhumanity. He then says they're not even literate. People, the Spanish also couldn't speak many of these native languages. There were these intermediaries, especially over time, that they could put things together between both groups. We're all illiterate somewhere. Now, many of them did not have written language. Okay. Then they talk about some cannibalism. Okay, you got some Aztecs on that one. But there's some ugly stuff going on in Europe too. And he basically says, listen, don't feel guilty about this. You do whatever you want to. Pretty gross stuff. On the other hand, Las Casas. Now, Las Casas is no angel. But this friar essentially says, sure, they're not quite as good as us. But he does say, once we teach them our things, our religion, our culture, you'll find that they're very quick to learn, that they have some art that we should appreciate as well. And should we really be treating them as horribly? Is that the Christian thing to do, to basically be abusing them and stealing their gold? And so he's much more reflective of what eventually will become of the Spanish perspective, which is represented through mestizos. So it's a double-edged sword, for sure. The Spanish treatment of Native Americans at first is incredibly harsh. But over time, I mean, over a long time in many cases, you have the blending of the cultures to the point that they're their own thing, the mestizos, which is this just perfect meshing of the two. But don't be fooled. The quote unquote, according to Bailey's textbook, Black Legend is absolutely true. The natives endured horrific torture and mistreatment by the Spanish. Don't misconstrue what I'm saying, though. The English were just less horrific, but they're pretty horrible too. And we're going to get into the English colonization and the English treatment of Native Americans tomorrow. So, hope this makes sense. Shoot me any questions if you have them, and hope all are doing well. See you guys.